The rain had been falling steadily for hours, drumming on the asphalt like an impatient drummer insisting the world move faster than it could. On the corner of Maple Street, a small, weathered bar exuded warmth, its neon sign flickering against the stormy night. Inside, the bar was alive with the low hum of conversation, laughter spilling from worn booths, and the clink of glasses punctuating the background music. It was Friday night, the kind where locals sought refuge from workweeks full of stress and regret, the kind where nobody noticed strangers unless they demanded attention. And yet, as the door creaked open, the room instinctively turned its attention, though unconsciously, toward the woman who entered. Stepped in with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from someone who has seen and endured more than most could imagine. Her damp jacket clung lightly to her frame, dark hair pulled into a practical bun at the nape of her neck. Her face was calm, almost blank, but her eyes moved with the precision of someone scanning a room for threats, opportunities, and exits all at once. She didn't glance around to take in the crowd socially. She simply assessed. The bar was familiar territory for some of its patrons, but was not familiar to any of them. Yet something about her seemed different. Not flashy, not dramatic, not demanding attention, but quietly commanding it nonetheless. Even the bartender, a man who had seen every kind of person walk through the door over 2 decades, felt a small chill of recognition in her posture. There was discipline in her back, control in her movements, and a subtle alertness that screamed experience over curiosity. Slid into a corner seat, close enough to the door to see anyone coming in, yet far enough away to avoid unwanted confrontation. She set down her small purse and ordered a glass of water, the request simple, matter-of-fact, lacking even a hint of judgment toward the room. The bartender gave a slight nod, pouring her water, glancing over occasionally with that mix of curiosity and unease reserved for patrons who carried invisible weight. Around her, life in the bar went on. Laughter erupted from a table of blue-collar workers, their faces flushed with drink and familiarity. A jukebox in the corner played a classic country tune, its twangy guitar providing a soundtrack to conversations filled with sports, work complaints, and half-forgotten jokes. Smoke lingered faintly from a few patrons who insisted on lighting their cigarettes indoors despite the posted signs. His presence barely disturbed the rhythm, but she became a quiet center, the room's energy bending subtly around her. People began to notice the way she held herself, the steady calm of her hands, the absence of nervous habits that everyone else displayed. Her eyes, dark and unyielding, scanned each person who walked by, yet never rested too long. They were curious eyes but not judgmental, assessing but not invasive. From the corner of the bar, a man named Cole, who had served in the military years ago, squinted. There was something about her gait, her shoulder alignment, the way her legs moved with controlled precision that looked familiar. He couldn't place it yet, but there was recognition forming at the edge of his memory, like a name just out of reach on the tip of the tongue. Didn't attempt to integrate herself into the bar's social rhythm. She didn't laugh too loudly at jokes or comment on the music. Her stillness contrasted sharply with the chaos around her. But that stillness wasn't emptiness. It was awareness, discipline, readiness. She was present in a way that most people in the bar weren't, and it made her quietly magnetic. People instinctively gave her more space than she needed, a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement that she was not someone to be trifled with. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the windows with a violent insistence. The wind rattled the old neon sign above the door, casting erratic shadows across space when she glanced toward it. She took a slow sip of water, her expression unreadable, and let the taste anchor her. Every detail mattered. Who was talking loudly, who was quiet and watchful, who might get aggressive if provoked. Though she looked serene, every sense was alert, cataloging, ready. It wasn't long before a group of newcomers arrived, disturbing the established flow of the bar. They were loud, rough around the edges, and clearly looking for a place to dominate, to assert some shallow sense of superiority. Among them was a man named Rick Turner, whose presence brought a tension that could be felt even before he stepped fully inside. His eyes scanned the room like a predator, finally locking on the quiet figure who refused to be intimidated by his performance. He approached with swagger, loud and intrusive, breaking the bar's delicate rhythm, didn't flinch or glance at him. Her eyes continued their slow survey of the room, but Rick's ego demanded recognition. He mocked her choice of drink, sneering and prodding. His words were sharp and his tone was designed to provoke a reaction. Didn't give him one. Not a flinch, not a glance, not a verbal acknowledgement. She simply sat still and calm, her gaze steady but unmoving. Her silence only fueled his irritation, his need to dominate. The room felt heavier as tension built like a storm waiting to break. Patrons exchanged nervous glances. They could sense, even if they didn't understand, that calmness was not weakness, that her quiet was not ignorance. Something powerful lingered beneath her composed exterior. And so she sat, water in hand, observing, unshaken, as the storm outside mirrored the growing tension within the bar. It was the kind of calm that precedes confrontation, the stillness before action. Unnoticed yet fully present had arrived quietly, but the stage was set and the night was far from over. Rick Turner had been having a terrible week. The small factory where he worked was cutting hours, his paycheck was shrinking, and the frustrations of life clung to him like wet clothes on a stormy night. By the time he staggered toward Maple Street, the rain had soaked through his worn jacket, chilling him to the bone. He wanted warmth, he wanted laughter, he wanted attention, the kind that validated his existence in a world that often ignored him. The bar's neon sign flickered as he pushed the door open, announcing himself with a gust of wet air. His boots splashed puddles across the wooden floor, and the chatter of the room dimmed briefly, instinctively noticing the storm that had arrived in human form. Rick's eyes immediately sought a target, someone he could assert dominance over, a way to reclaim the confidence he'd lost in the week's grind. That's when he saw her, seated quietly in the corner, sipping water, calm as if the world and its noise existed in a separate dimension. Her posture was rigid but relaxed, her gaze scanning without accusation, measuring without judgment. Rick's curiosity quickly turned to irritation. Who was she to sit there silently, refusing to acknowledge him? His ego bristled at her calmness, and that bristle demanded an outlet. He leaned toward the nearest patron and whispered something snide about her, a mix of jest and derision. When she didn't react, he laughed too loudly, forcing the room to notice his presence. A few heads turned. Some patrons shook their heads and went back to their drinks, accustomed to his antics. The bartender gave him a sidelong look, a silent warning that Rick ignored. Rick took a few steps toward, swaggering with exaggerated confidence. He leaned over her table, voice low but edged with mockery. "Hey, water girl, don't act too good for the rest of us." His words were deliberate, meant to draw attention and provoke a reaction. The surrounding patrons glanced at each other, sensing tension building. A storm was brewing, but it wasn't outside. It was in the small corner of the bar where calm met chaos. Didn't respond. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Her eyes stayed on the table, observing Rick's approach without acknowledgement. Her silence was a mirror, reflecting the insecurity and ego of the man standing before her. For Rick, silence was a weapon. It undermined him, made him uncertain, yet furious. "You gonna ignore me all night?" Rick demanded, raising his voice slightly. The laughter at nearby tables faltered. No one had ever seen react, but her stillness spoke louder than any word. She was unshakable. The realization that she might not fear him sent a ripple of unease through Rick, though his pride demanded that he keep pressing. He leaned even closer, invading her space. "Don't give me that look," he sneered. "You think you're better than me?" The bar felt the shift. Patrons sensed the storm approaching. Drinks stopped mid-sip, conversations paused, and even the jukebox's twangy guitar seemed muffled under the tension. Rick's aggression had an audience now, and he thrived on it. Finally shifted her gaze, lifting her eyes to meet his. But it wasn't anger or fear that met his eyes. It was calm, piercing, measured. Every detail of him was catalogued in silence. The way he shifted weight, the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his right hand. She wasn't scared. She wasn't judging. She was simply aware. And awareness can be far more intimidating than fury. Rick's confidence began to waver, though his face maintained its bravado. He tried again, this time with a laugh, attempting to mask the uncertainty creeping in. "Come on, water girl, say something. Don't act all mysterious. We're just having fun." His voice carried over the bar now, drawing glances from strangers and friends alike. But his expression didn't change. She sipped her water slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably long. The bartender, feeling the shift in atmosphere, approached subtly. "Hey, Rick, maybe take a seat and calm down," he suggested, carefully. Rick waved him off, the gesture dismissive, insisting that silence was an invitation, that he could bend her reaction like he had so many others. Pride was a dangerous fuel, and Rick was fully ignited. Rick circled her table now, a predator packing before a cornered animal, or so he thought. He leaned over her chair again, placing a hand on her shoulder, the motion supposed to intimidate, to provoke. Unflinching, moved her hand away calmly, a subtle but clear boundary. The surrounding patrons watched, the room frozen in anticipation. This was no longer just a bar confrontation. It was a test of nerve and strength. Rick's irritation turned to outright fury. "You think you can ignore me?" he barked. "I don't care who you are." The words were loud, careless, reckless. Patrons whispered among themselves, uneasy. Something about silence unnerved even the rowdiest locals. She didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She simply remained seated, sipping her water, her calm almost supernatural against Rick's storm of ego and alcohol-fueled aggression. Then came the subtle shift, the kind only those trained to notice tension could perceive. Shoulders were steady, her hands controlled, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't defensive, she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't reactive. The silence that had grown between them was no longer empty. It was potent, a quiet pressure building steadily against Rick's bluster. Rick, blinded by his own pride, didn't recognize it yet. He took a step closer, voice raised, leaning into the corner of her space. "Say something, or are you too scared?" The room held its collective breath. Patrons glanced at one another, sensing the moment when silence would snap, when chaos might erupt. His calm seemed almost preternatural, a wall of resolve that absorbed his aggression without moving an inch. A former soldier, sitting near the pool table, squinted, recognizing something familiar in his posture. The movements of her body, the precision in her stillness, the subtle tension in her hands. She wasn't just calm, she was trained. And not in any ordinary way. Recognition sparked quietly in his mind. This is someone dangerous, someone disciplined, someone with experience the likes of which most civilians couldn't imagine. But Rick, pride and alcohol clouding judgment, didn't yet see the full picture. His need to dominate, to assert himself, had him teetering on the edge of recklessness. He would soon discover that quiet was not weakness but strength. And strength, especially the kind honed over years of impossible training, can be more terrifying than fury. The rain outside intensified, hammering against the windows as if the storm itself were echoing the tension within. Remained seated unshaken, her gaze scanning but never settling, her posture unyielding. Rick's aggression was loud and clumsy, but her quiet control had already begun to undermine him. In that small corner of the bar, a battle of wills had begun, silent yet charged, and neither knew how quickly it would escalate, or how irreversible the consequences might be. Quiet and unassuming to anyone who didn't know better, was about to prove that calm is not passivity, and silence is not surrender. Rick Turner was about to learn a lesson the hard way. Some battles are won not with shouts, but with control, precision, and patience. The tension in the bar had become almost palpable, a quiet storm pressing on every patron. Rick Turner's bravado had been met with an unyielding calm, and that calm, more than any insult or challenge, ignited a deeper, darker rage within him. His face flushed crimson, pride wounded by his unshakable composure. Every second her eyes met his without fear, his irritation grew, coiling with each beat of silence. "Are you gonna sit there like a statue all night?" Rick barked, leaning over her chair once more. The words were meant to provoke, to shatter her composure, but instead, they only underscored the contrast between his raw aggression and her poised stillness. The other patrons shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the confrontation was no longer just verbal. They had all witnessed arguments before, but there was something different about, something that hinted at consequences Rick hadn't even considered. He leaned even closer, closing the small distance between them. His hand reached impulsively toward her shoulder, meant to intimidate, to assert dominance, to force acknowledgement. Without hesitation or flinching, moved her hand aside with deliberate calm. The motion was small, almost imperceptible to most, but it carried a weight of authority. Rick's brow furrowed in confusion. He had expected fear, a reaction, anything, but not this cold, measured resistance. "You think you can just ignore me?" he spat, voice rising. The sound ricocheted off the walls, drawing more attention. The jukebox music seemed to falter under the tension, the laughter of the regulars fading to near silence. Patrons instinctively leaned back in their seats, glancing between the two, holding their breath as if the next move could change everything. Rick's hand shot again, this time slapping across the cheek. The bar froze. A pin-drop silence fell over the room. Conversations halted mid-sentence. The clink of glasses seemed to pause in midair, and even the rain against the windows appeared to quiet. His head remained upright, her eyes locked on Rick's, unflinching. Her face bore no fear, no panic, no anger. Just a piercing, calculated calm that sent a ripple of shock through the onlookers. Time seemed to stretch. For the first few moments, no one moved. Rick expected her to shrink, to cry out, to react in a way that would let him feel victorious. But she didn't. She remained seated, every muscle controlled, every breath measured. Her gaze was steady, unblinking, radiating a quiet authority that made Rick pause, if only for an instant. And in that instant, whispers began to form in the minds of the patrons. Something about this woman was not ordinary. From the corner of the bar, a man named Cole, a retired Navy officer who had served alongside some of the nation's most disciplined personnel, squinted and whispered to himself. His instincts screamed recognition, memories surfacing of someone he had encountered in a different life, a life of impossible challenges and unyielding discipline. He didn't speak aloud, but the recognition was enough to shift the room's energy subtly. Rick's grin faltered. His confidence, so carefully constructed through posturing and alcohol-fueled bravado, wavered. The slap, meant to dominate and humiliate, had not produced the expected reaction. Instead, it seemed to have triggered a subtle but undeniable shift in the room. Patrons began to sit, some leaning forward in cautious anticipation. Others looked away, afraid of the storm that might be unleashed. A whisper, soft but clear, began circulating near the bar's edge. "She's Navy SEAL." The words seemed to hang in the air like a weight, invisible but undeniably present. It was enough for some of the more perceptive patrons to recognize that this was not an ordinary woman. His calm was not ignorance. It was power, honed and refined in a way that most people could not comprehend. Rick's hand twitched at his side, uncertainty creeping in, though he masked it with a false chuckle. The bartender, sensing the potential for violence, subtly moved closer, ready to intervene. But even he paused when he caught his gaze. There was no panic there, only observation, and it was enough to make him realize that this woman, if provoked further, could handle herself in ways that far exceeded anything he had seen in this bar before. Rick, unaware of the whispers, attempted to reassert control. He leaned down, lowering his face closer to hers, his voice dripping with derision. "You think I care who you are? I don't care." His words were loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances. The joke, if it had ever existed, was gone. Now it was a test of nerve and will. Finally rose from her chair, not in haste, not in anger, but with deliberate, fluid precision. She stood tall, her presence commanding. Every motion was calculated, every movement silent but intentional. Her gaze never wavered from Rick's, and in it lay a quiet warning. She was fully aware, fully prepared, and fully capable. Rick's confidence faltered for the first time. His bravado, which had carried him this far, seemed insufficient against the calm authority emanating from. The room collectively exhaled, sensing that the quiet woman before them was no ordinary patron. Even without striking a blow, she had altered the dynamic of the space. "Enough," said softly, her voice controlled but unyielding. "We can end this now." The words were calm, almost gentle, yet they carried the weight of command. Rick hesitated, his ego warring with his growing unease. He looked around the bar, noting the stares of those who had witnessed the slap and now watched intently, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The bar, previously a haven of casual conversation and friendly competition, had transformed into an arena of anticipation. Everyone understood instinctively that calm was not passive. It was active. It was lethal in its potential. The slap, intended to provoke submission, had instead revealed a strength Rick had not accounted for: discipline, control, and lethal readiness. A few patrons quietly murmured to each other, trying to make sense of what they were witnessing. "Did you see her posture? Look at her hands, steady. She's not bluffing, that's trained discipline." The words were hushed, almost reverent, yet carried an undeniable weight. Rick, however, remained mostly oblivious to the whispers, focused on salvaging his pride, unaware that his next move could be decisive. Calm allowed her to assess every angle. She noted the proximity of other patrons, the exits, and the bartender's subtle positioning. Her mind cataloged every threat, every opportunity, while her face remained serene. She didn't need to raise her voice. The energy she projected was enough to command the room. In that moment, silence became her ally, and observation became her weapon. The tension was electric, thickening with every passing second. Rick fidgeted, uncertainty creeping into his aggressive stance. The slap had failed to break her, and now he felt the pressure of her presence, invisible but undeniable. The bar held its collective breath, aware that the confrontation had reached a turning point. Finally, Rick's pride, combined with his confusion and intoxication, drove him to another impulsive act, an escalation that would test the limits of patience and reveal the true power behind quiet composure. What happened next would mark the night forever in the memories of those present, proving that appearances can deceive, and that calm, deliberate strength often carries the loudest impact. Quiet and unassuming had arrived at the storm, and now the storm had come to her. The bar waited, suspended in suspense, as the moment of reckoning drew near. Every patron understood without words that what happened next would not be ordinary. The tension that had been quietly building in the bar now reached an almost unbearable peak. Rick Turner's eyes darted from to the nearest patrons, looking for some sign that the room would back him up. But the faces staring back were not of indifference. They were of quiet curiosity, an undercurrent of anticipation, and more than that, a subtle awareness that the woman before him was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. From the corner, Cole's gaze never left. A flicker of recognition crossed his weathered features. Years ago, he had served with people trained beyond normal comprehension, men and women who could move with precision and control in ways that seemed almost impossible. And suddenly, the posture, the stillness, the measured breathing of triggered that memory like a spark to dry tinder. She was not just disciplined. She was exceptional, and she carried it lightly, as though it were simply who she was. The bar remained silent, all eyes subtly trained on the escalating confrontation. Rick's bravado began to crumble under his unwavering stare. Every instinct he had relied on, arrogance, intimidation, noise, failed against the quiet force emanating from her. His gestures grew exaggerated, his words sharper, louder, desperate for any response. "Say something, don't just sit there," he barked, slamming a hand on the table, but remained composed. Her eyes never wavered. Her lips never parted except for the occasional, calculated sip of water. And then it happened. A quiet, almost imperceptible murmur began to ripple through the room. One of the patrons, leaning against the far wall, whispered something to his friend. "She's Navy SEAL." The words were soft, almost casual, but in a room frozen by tension, they carried the weight of revelation. Heads turned slightly, glances exchanged. As the whisper made its way from ear to ear, growing in significance with each repetition. Rick didn't hear the whisper at first. His mind was consumed with disbelief, frustration, and the urgent need to assert dominance. But the subtle shift in the room was unmistakable. Patrons leaned back slightly, as if stepping away from a potential storm. Conversations had ceased entirely. Even the bartender, who had seen countless brawls and altercations over the years, froze, realizing that this was not just another drunken argument. Cole, unable to contain himself, leaned slightly forward. That's, he murmured under his breath to no one in particular. I can't believe it's really her. She was one of the first female Navy SEALs. The words sent a ripple of awe through the corner of the bar. The former soldier's recognition added credibility to the whispers, and the energy in the room began to shift. Rick's bravado began to falter, though he did not yet understand why. His confidence, carefully constructed over years of social dominance and physical intimidation, started to crack. He glanced around the room, noting the uneasy expressions, the subtle respect forming in the eyes of patrons who had once been indifferent. Something about's presence, and now her reputation, had altered the entire dynamic. Finally allowed her lips to part, but her voice was calm, soft, and yet undeniably commanding. You had your chance to walk away, she said. Her words were neither loud nor aggressive, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Every patron felt the authority in her tone, the discipline of someone who had faced dangers far beyond this small bar. Rick froze, his chest tightening as her calmness collided with his storm of arrogance. The whispering continued, now growing louder, more confident. She's Navy SEAL, she can take you down without even trying, don't push it. The rumor spread through the bar like wildfire, and the collective tension shifted from suspense to cautious awe. Rick's confusion deepened. He had expected submission, confrontation, perhaps fear, but not this. Calm, combined with the revelation of her past, created a barrier he could not penetrate with words, gestures, or intimidation. Patrons instinctively moved slightly away from Rick, their postures subtly altering as if preparing to intervene, yet unsure what would happen next. Even the bartender, who had handled aggressive patrons countless times, felt a strange reverence. This was not a confrontation he could resolve with intervention alone. This was a clash of worlds, the brute force of unearned confidence meeting the disciplined mastery of someone trained for life-or-death scenarios. Rick, panicking silently, tried to regain control. I don't care who you are, he barked, his voice cracking slightly. The words rang hollow. The room had shifted under his quiet authority, and he could feel it. Patrons whispered behind their hands, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. Cole's quiet murmurs to himself continued. She's precise, deadly, calm. God help anyone who underestimates her. Still seated, allowed her gaze to sweep the room with subtle acknowledgement. She noted every exit, every potential ally, and every threat in the room. Her calm was not casual, it was preparation. Every muscle, every sense was poised for whatever might come next. And yet, she radiated a patience that made her appear untouchable, a paradoxical combination of readiness and serenity. Rick's hand twitched at his side. Pride, fear, and confusion warred within him. He had assumed that loudness and aggression would control the room, and for a moment he had thought he controlled. But now, the whispers confirmed what he could not yet process. This woman was trained in ways he could neither understand nor counter. The energy in the bar had shifted, the power balance irreversibly tilted. The bar's atmosphere, once casual and rowdy, became tense, reverent, and anticipatory. Patrons exchanged glances, some shaking their heads in awe, others whispering softly. Did you hear? Navy SEAL, no way. She didn't even flinch, that's insane. The murmurs grew louder, filling the space with a collective understanding. This was not a simple altercation. This was a display of quiet authority that could not be challenged without consequence. Rick tried once more to assert dominance, stepping closer, attempting to intimidate through posture and volume alone. I said, talk to me. His words rang hollow against the calm, collected energy that exuded. She remained seated, eyes fixed on him with a measured intensity that felt almost physical, a weight pressing against his ego, his arrogance, and his pride. Then, with a subtle shift in posture, rose slightly, just enough to make her presence fully felt. Her movement was precise, deliberate, and unmistakably controlled. The room seemed to contract around her, as though every breath, every glance, every heartbeat was now synchronized with her silent authority. The whisper spread again, louder this time. "She doesn't even need to move to dominate the room, don't test her." Rick's bravado finally faltered completely. The room had witnessed enough to know that was no ordinary woman, and Rick himself began to sense, deep in his chest, that he had overstepped in ways that could not be undone. His hands clenched, his jaw tightened, but the energy emanating from was no longer something to challenge. It was a force to be reckoned with, and he was unprepared. Cole, watching quietly from the corner, whispered to himself, a grim mix of awe and relief. "She's still the same, still deadly, still in control." His words echoed in the minds of the patrons, solidifying the shift in perception. The quiet woman in the corner, who had entered hours ago unnoticed, was now the center of attention, not because of arrogance or show, but because of undeniable authority, discipline, and presence. Calm, her stillness, and now the revelation of her past had transformed the bar. The whispers confirmed it. The room collectively understood that this confrontation was no longer trivial, that Rick Turner's aggression would be met with consequences he could not predict. And in that suspended moment, everyone waited, breathless, for the inevitable, when silence, discipline, and awareness would meet recklessness and ego. The storm outside mirrored the tension inside, rain hammering against the windows, lightning flashing intermittently across the darkened sky. It was as if nature itself had acknowledged the significance of what was about to unfold. Quiet, disciplined, and commanding, had shifted the balance of power in a room full of bystanders, and everyone present knew that the climax was approaching. The air in the bar was thick with anticipation, charged like static before a lightning strike. Rick Turner's chest heaved, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the table, trembling with a mixture of fury and fear. The whisper of past training had spread through the bar, and now even the most indifferent patrons sat forward, sensing the storm that was about to break. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat felt amplified in the heavy silence. Rick, blinded by pride and intoxicated bravado, decided to escalate. He stepped closer, attempting to close the gap between them, his hand rising instinctively as if he could force submission by sheer weight. "I said, talk to me," he barked, the words cracking under pressure. The bark was meant to assert control, but it fell flat, ricocheting off the invisible wall had erected with nothing more than calm awareness. Remained seated for a heartbeat longer, her gaze locked on Rick, unwavering. Then, in the most fluid motion possible, she leaned slightly forward, her eyes never leaving his. There was no anger, no hostility, just observation. But that observation was lethal, a psychological pressure that made Rick falter mid-step. He blinked, confused and unnerved, suddenly aware that his usual tactics, loudness, intimidation, bluster, were failing against her composure. The bartender, watching from a safe distance, instinctively reached for the phone to call the police but hesitated. Something in its movements told him intervention might not be necessary. She didn't need anyone to back her up. The force she carried was internal, precise, and unmistakable. The patrons in the room, sensing this, instinctively shifted slightly backward, giving her space without a word. Rick, frustrated by the silence and unnerving calm, attempted another lunge, raising a hand as if to grab her arm. The motion was impulsive, reckless, a mistake made worse by his overconfidence. Reacted instantly with the kind of precision only trained bodies can execute. In a blink, she moved to intercept his motion. Her hands, steady and exact, locked onto his wrist, twisting and turning him with controlled force. Rick stumbled but did not immediately hit the ground. The room collectively held its breath. What had seemed like a standoff was now transforming into a display of discipline and skill. The movements were deliberate but economical, each step designed to neutralize aggression without unnecessary force. She didn't strike him. She didn't yell. She controlled. That control alone was enough to dominate, to terrify, to shift the balance of power entirely. Rick's momentum carried him forward slightly, but adjusted seamlessly, rotating him into a wrist lock that forced him to his knees. The expression on his face shifted from arrogance to disbelief. He struggled, yelping as the physical and psychological weight of her training pressed against him. The sound of his attempts to resist only emphasized the mastery with which she held him. She's controlling him without hitting him," a patron whispered, voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly might provoke an eruption. Others nodded subtly, some leaning back in awe. Even those who had doubted the whispers about her being a Navy SEAL now understood. They were not exaggerations. They had witnessed the first signs of her true capability. Spoke, her voice calm, measured, and commanding. "We're done." The words were soft, yet they carried an undeniable authority. The simplicity of her statement belied the power behind it. It ended the struggle without raising her hand in anger. Rick's body went slack for a moment, the fight draining out of him as he realized that the woman he had underestimated was in complete control of the situation. The bartender moved cautiously forward, speaking into his phone, but he knew the police would merely witness what had already accomplished. She released Rick's wrist carefully, allowing him to fall fully onto the floor in a controlled manner. No unnecessary force, no humiliation beyond the natural consequences of his arrogance. Every patron in the room understood that he had been subdued, not through violence, but through skill and calm precision. Rick groaned as he struggled to sit up, confusion and fear mingling with shame. His chest heaved, his hands rubbed over bruised wrists, and his mind raced to comprehend what had just occurred. This was not a typical bar fight. This was a lesson in discipline, composure, and unassailable strength. Remained standing, poised, breathing slowly, her presence alone now commanding the attention and respect of the room. Cole leaned slightly forward, whispering to himself, "She's still the same, still precise, still deadly." The words reflected what everyone was thinking. Had not only defended herself but had done so in a way that demonstrated complete mastery over her environment, her actions, and her opponent. Her training, honed over years of unimaginable challenges, was evident in every micro-movement, every controlled breath. The patrons exhaled collectively, relief and awe mingling in the room. Conversation slowly resumed, quieter now, laced with reverence. Some patrons offered nods of respect while others shook their heads in disbelief. The lesson was clear. Arrogance could not overcome skill, and noise could not overpower calm. The bar had witnessed a demonstration of restraint, of authority earned through discipline rather than intimidation. Rick, now fully seated on the floor, looked up with a mix of fear, disbelief, and begrudging respect. His pride had been shattered, replaced with the uncomfortable realization that he had misjudged her entirely. He had expected submission or fear, but had been met instead with mastery, an experience he would not forget. Noticing his hesitation, spoke again, softer this time, almost a murmur but firm enough to cut through the room's quiet. "You don't have to be my enemy. Walk away and no one is hurt." Her words were deliberate, offering a way out, a chance for redemption, but they also carried the weight of inevitability. There was no room for continued aggression. The power she projected was unmistakable. The bartender, sensing the shift in energy, subtly guided Rick toward the door. The man stumbled forward, silent, humbled, and fully aware of the consequences of his actions. Patrons watched as the scene concluded, recognizing that what they had seen was rare, an exhibition of controlled power that required no shouting, no weapons, no spectacle beyond skill, composure, and awareness. As returned to her corner seat, she allowed herself a slow sip of water, her calm once again restored. She scanned the room, noting the reactions of the patrons, the slight shifts in posture, the quiet nods of recognition. The bar had changed in that moment. Everyone had witnessed a display of restraint and authority that would be remembered long after the storm outside had passed. Even Rick, sitting quietly near the door, understood. He had learned a lesson that could not be taught with words alone. The quiet woman he had mocked had demonstrated strength beyond his comprehension, humility in victory, and control without cruelty. And for everyone present the lesson was clear. True power was often invisible, subtle, and measured, but when it manifested, it could change everything in an instant. Remained seated, unassuming yet commanding, allowing the room to absorb the finality of the moment. Her calm was not passive, it was active, a presence that had transformed the night from a potential brawl into a lesson in discipline, respect, and self-control. The bar exhaled collectively, relief and awe mingling in the silent understanding that, quiet and composed, had turned what could have been chaos into order with nothing more than her presence and skill. By the time the police arrived, the situation had already resolved itself. Rick Turner sat silently, subdued not by force but by respect for a skill he could not hope to match. Gave a concise statement, polite, measured, and accurate, demonstrating the same calm precision that had guided her through every moment of the confrontation. She left quietly afterward, allowing the patrons to digest the gravity of what had occurred. The storm outside had begun to ease, but the energy inside the bar lingered. The patrons spoke in hushed tones, recounting every detail, the calm that had countered arrogance, the precision that had neutralized aggression, and the quiet authority that had changed the entire dynamic of the room. The quiet woman who had walked in unnoticed had proven that true power did not need to be loud, flashy, or violent. It only needed to be precise, controlled, and undeniable. The bar had slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the storm of tension that had just diffused. Glasses clinked, conversations resumed, and the jukebox cautiously played a soft melody. Yet the air remained charged, thick with awe and lingering whispers. Every patron, even those not directly involved, felt the weight of what had just occurred. This wasn't just a bar fight. It had been a demonstration of precision, discipline, and power that few could ever imagine. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the streets slick and glimmering under the flickering neon lights. Inside, conversations moved from speculation about Rick Turner's humiliation to a quiet curiosity about herself. Who was she? How could a single person, so unassuming, command such authority with nothing but her presence and skill? Even the bartender, a man who prided himself on reading every patron who walked through the door, admitted silently that he had never seen anything like it. Cole, seated near the corner where he had observed from the start, leaned closer to the bartender. "She's a Navy SEAL," he whispered, the words low but deliberate. The bartender blinked, hesitant to interrupt the flow of conversation but compelled by the weight in his voice. "A SEAL? You mean like Special Forces?" he asked, barely believing it. Nodded, the memory of training exercises and impossible missions flooding back. One of the first female SEALs. She's been through hell and back, and she's still precise, still calm, still untouchable. The revelation spread like wildfire. Patrons leaned in, eavesdropping on the conversation, eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The quiet woman in the corner was no ordinary citizen. She had training that few could even imagine, survived missions that would break most, and returned to civilian life carrying an aura of discipline and authority that had now been revealed for all to witness. Rick Turner, still seated near the door, overheard fragments of the whispers. His ego, bruised and raw, struggled to reconcile the truth. The woman he had attempted to intimidate was not only highly trained, but had possessed complete control over him without raising a hand in anger. The realization gnawed at him, a mixture of fear, shame, and awe. He had underestimated her entirely, and the truth of her background made that mistake impossible to ignore. Remained at her table, quietly observing the room, her calm returning like a tide washing over the remnants of chaos. She sipped her water with the same meticulous care as before, her demeanor composed, her body language controlled. Yet beneath that serene exterior, her mind catalogued every detail: the patrons' reactions, the bar's layout, potential threats, and the subtle shifts in energy. Even in civilian life, the habits of a Navy SEAL were ingrained, and had never stopped practicing them. A young man at the bar, curious and audacious, finally found his courage. "Excuse me," he said, voice tentative. Were you really a Navy SEAL?" glanced at him, her eyes calm but piercing, measuring his intent. She didn't answer immediately, allowing the silence to communicate more than words could. Then, with a controlled exhale, she nodded slightly. "I was," she said simply. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, yet carried the weight of experience, discipline, and history. The young man's eyes widened, and the surrounding patrons leaned closer, absorbing the confirmation. I can't believe it," he murmured. "You're amazing. How did you even survive that?" Offered no dramatics, no embellishments. She simply said, "Discipline, training, and the right mindset. Fear doesn't disappear, it's controlled." Her words, calm and precise, resonated with everyone in the room. There was no boast, no arrogance, just truth. Cole, recognizing the impact of his words, nodded slowly. He had trained with people like her, seen them face impossible odds and emerge intact. And now, watching her interact with ordinary citizens, he understood the weight of her presence. Was extraordinary, but she carried her past with humility. She did not flaunt her achievements. She lived them quietly, letting her actions speak louder than words. The bar's patrons, who had witnessed the confrontation, began to connect the dots. The calm authority, the precision of movement, the unwavering focus, it all made sense now. She hadn't just controlled Rick Turner, she had controlled the room, commanded respect, and turned potential chaos into order without ever raising her voice in anger. The whispers became audible now, blending awe with curiosity. "She's a seal, she's incredible. She didn't even have to hit him." Even Rick Turner, humbled and shaken, slowly stood. His earlier arrogance was replaced with a reluctant respect. He approached, head lowered slightly, hands trembling. I didn't know," he stammered. I'm sorry." Eyes met his, calm and unyielding. She didn't smile or lecture. She simply nodded, acknowledging his apology without fanfare, allowing him a measure of dignity despite the lessons he had learned. The bartender, sensing the moment's significance, finally spoke. You've changed this place tonight," he said, voice tinged with awe, offered a small nod, serene, as if acknowledging the truth without taking ownership. She wasn't seeking recognition. She was simply living in the consequences of her training and her choices. Word of his presence spread quickly through the small town. By morning, every local knew about the quiet woman who had walked into the bar unnoticed, subdued an aggressive patron, and left the room changed forever. Social media posts, whispered stories, and casual conversations recounted the event with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The legend of the quiet Navy SEAL who could command a room without violence grew rapidly, embedding itself into the town's collective consciousness. However, remained unaffected by the attention. She returned to her routine, moving through the world with the same measured calm, the same discipline that had guided her through her career. To her, the incident was simply a demonstration of what she had always been trained to do: assess, respond, and maintain control. She didn't seek glory or notoriety. She sought balance and precision in every action, in every decision, in every moment. Cole watched her one last time before leaving the bar, shaking his head in quiet admiration. "Still the same," he muttered under his breath. "Still calm, still deadly, still untouchable." His words were a fitting summary of the quiet strength had demonstrated, a force that required no theatrics, no embellishment, only discipline, awareness, and the willingness to act when necessary. The town would remember that night not just for the confrontation, but for the lesson it imparted. Power is quiet, authority is subtle, and true strength often lies beneath the surface, invisible to the untrained eye. Had shown them all that calm could command more than fury, and discipline could dominate more than aggression. The truth behind the quiet woman had been revealed, and it was far more extraordinary than anyone could have imagined. By the end of the night, the bar had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Rick Turner had quietly exited, humbled and chastened. Patrons lingered, talking in low voices about the events, replaying the confrontation in their minds. And the quiet woman who had entered unnoticed remained at her corner table, serene, observant, and untouchable, a living reminder of the power of discipline, the force of calm, and the enduring legacy of a Navy SEAL who had walked among them. No one knew where she would go next, or what challenges awaited her outside the bar. But one thing was certain: The quiet woman who had controlled a room without raising her voice had left an indelible mark, not only on the patrons present but on the very story of that small town. Truth was revealed, and it was as formidable as it was inspiring, a testament to training, courage, and the unyielding strength of a quiet life lived with purpose. The next morning, the town awoke to a quiet buzz that seemed to hang in the air like a gentle fog. Had disappeared from the bar without fanfare, but the story of the previous night traveled faster than the morning coffee lines. Patrons shared details over breakfast, embellishing slightly in some cases, but the core truth remained. The quiet woman who had walked into their lives and commanded attention with calm authority was a Navy SEAL, and no ordinary man could challenge her. Rick Turner, nursing a bruised ego and sore wrists, walked through the town with a mix of humiliation and disbelief. He replayed every moment in his head, the slap, the controlled restraint, the unflinching calm of gaze. He could not stop thinking about her. The realization that he had been bested by someone without even a raised voice was both infuriating and oddly humbling. For the first time in years, Rick questioned not just his actions but his entire approach to life. He found himself outside the local diner, watching as townspeople discussed the events animatedly, whispers and laughter intermingling with awe. Rick felt the weight of their stares, not judgmental, but recognizing that its presence had permanently shifted the town's perception of courage, control, and respect. He knew that he could not simply return to life as it had been before. Something had changed, and the truth was inescapable. He had been taught a lesson he could never unlearn. Meanwhile, the bar where the confrontation had occurred became a focal point of the story. Patrons lingered longer than usual, recounting every detail with a mix of reverence and excitement. The jukebox played softly in the background, but conversations often paused mid-sentence as someone recalled calm, measured gaze, her precise movements, and the way she had neutralized Rick's aggression without causing harm. The story became more than a retelling. It became a lesson in discipline, awareness, and strength. Cole, who had recognized skills from years of military service, returned to the bar mid-morning. He quietly approached the bartender, who had been replaying the night's events in his mind repeatedly. "She's remarkable," said, voice low, filled with admiration. "That level of control, that calm, she's the embodiment of everything a Navy SEAL is trained to be. And yet she wields it with humility, not arrogance." The bartender nodded, still processing the impact of what he had witnessed. The story spread beyond the bar quickly. Social media posts appeared, shared by patrons who had snapped photos or whispered the tale to friends. The legend of the quiet woman who had subdued an aggressive man with precision and calm began to grow exponentially. By noon, the story had reached nearly every corner of the town, and even nearby communities were buzzing with intrigue. People speculated about her past, her missions, and the extraordinary discipline that allowed her to dominate a room without violence. Rick Turner, unable to escape the weight of the story or his own embarrassment, sought out a way to make amends. He returned to the bar mid-afternoon, determined to confront the situation with honesty. He entered quietly, careful not to draw unnecessary attention, and approached the bartender. I want to apologize," he said, voice trembling slightly, "to her for everything." The bartender, recognizing genuine humility, nodded and directed Rick towards his usual corner. Was seated unassuming, sipping her water as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. Her calm was absolute, her presence composed, and yet there was an unmistakable awareness in her gaze. Rick hesitated, unsure how to begin, aware that any wrong word could undo his attempt at redemption. Observed him silently, her posture relaxed but unyielding, offering him space to speak while maintaining her unshakable authority. "I was wrong," Rick admitted finally, words halting but sincere. "I thought I could intimidate you, and I was completely mistaken. You were calm, precise, and I didn't deserve the lesson you gave me." Nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology without elaboration. Her simplicity reinforced the impact of her actions. She did not need to explain, chastise, or lecture. The lesson had already been delivered, and her calm response allowed Rick to absorb it fully. Patrons at nearby tables noticed the interaction, some whispering softly, others nodding in silent approval. Rick's humility, combined with measured acknowledgement, created a new dynamic in the room. Respect had replaced fear, and the story of the quiet woman's strength and discipline became not just an anecdote but a model for behavior, courage, and composure. By evening, the town's perception of had into legend. She was no longer just a Navy SEAL. She was a symbol of mastery, discipline, and quiet authority. Patrons of the bar shared the story repeatedly, emphasizing the lessons learned. Arrogance could not overcome skill, aggression could not defeat calm, and strength did not require theatrics. His presence, unassuming yet commanding, had reshaped the town's understanding of courage. Rick, transformed by his experience, began to change as well. He approached life with a newfound awareness, understanding that ego and aggression were not measures of strength. His demonstration of restraint and precision became a benchmark for his own growth, a reminder that real power lies in control, patience, and disciplined action. He no longer sought to dominate others, but to understand the value of calm authority. Even those who had not witnessed the confrontation firsthand felt its impact. Stories circulated in schools, offices, and public spaces, recounting calm yet decisive handling of a tense situation. Children marveled at the idea that a quiet woman could command a room without aggression. Adults reflected on the subtle yet powerful lesson that strength comes in many forms, and true mastery requires patience, awareness, and humility. Cole, observing the ripple effect, smiled quietly to himself. "She didn't just teach one man a lesson," he murmured. "She taught the whole town what it means to have strength without ego, courage without arrogance, and control without violence." His words captured the essence of his presence, a legacy built not on notoriety or loud action, but on discipline, observation, and unwavering calm. By nightfall, the bar was quiet, filled with patrons reflecting on the events of the day. Remained at her corner table, serene and composed, her eyes scanning the room casually yet attentively. She had walked into a small town as an ordinary presence, yet her actions had transformed perceptions, shifted dynamics, and left an indelible mark. Her legacy was not created through stories she told, but through the consequences of her calm authority and precise skill. Rick Turner left the bar one final time that evening, his demeanor subdued, his perspective forever altered. The lesson he had learned, the power of discipline, the impact of calm strength, the importance of respect, would guide him in the months and years ahead. Actions had created more than a story. They had created a standard, a reminder of what it means to be truly strong. The town would never forget that quiet woman in the corner, Navy SEAL and master of her own presence. Her legacy spread quietly but profoundly, influencing conversations, behaviors, and even the aspirations of those who heard her story. Unassuming and precise, had proven that true power is silent, strength is disciplined, and respect is earned not through loud confrontation but through unwavering control. By the time the last patrons left the bar, the legend of the quiet woman had fully taken root. Remained, observing, breathing, and existing with the calm precision that had defined her life. The town had learned its lesson. Some battles are not won through anger or aggression, but through the quiet, deliberate mastery of oneself. Had left an imprint that would endure far longer than any fleeting act of bravado. Her quiet legacy, now the benchmark for courage, respect, and strength. Weeks passed since the night walked into the small-town bar, and yet her presence lingered in every corner of the community. The memory of her calm authority and precise control had become more than a story. It had become a benchmark, a legend, a lesson etched into the collective consciousness of everyone who had witnessed it. From the bartender to the youngest bar regular, everyone seemed to carry a piece of that night with them, a reminder that true power often hid behind quiet confidence. Rick Turner, the man whose arrogance had sparked the confrontation, had transformed in ways few could have predicted. The physical discomfort he had endured, the sore wrists, the bruised ego, faded with time, but the psychological imprint remained. He walked through town differently now, shoulders slightly less tense, voice less forceful, gestures more measured. He no longer sought dominance through intimidation. Instead, he sought understanding, patience, and the cautious respect had demonstrated with her mere presence. The bar, once just a place for casual conversation and weekend drinks, had become a quiet shrine to the lesson had delivered. Patrons frequently revisited the story, embellishing minor details with humor but always returning to the undeniable truth. The woman who had walked in quietly was a Navy SEAL, and she had subdued aggression with nothing more than calm precision. The tale grew, spreading through social media, town gossip, and casual conversation, but it never exaggerated the core lesson. Respect is earned through skill and discipline, not through force or bluster. Herself remained largely unseen. She returned to the town, blending into everyday life as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. She purchased groceries without fanfare, sipped coffee at the corner, and walked the quiet streets with the same measured steps that had always defined her. Yet her aura, the discipline honed over years as a Navy SEAL, remained undeniable to those who had witnessed her firsthand. People instinctively gave her space, spoke quietly, and maintained a subtle reverence in her presence, even if only subconsciously. Cole, the retired officer who had recognized immediately, continued to observe her from a respectful distance. He saw the way the town's energy subtly shifted when she walked through it, how conversations paused, how young men straightened their posture, and how even the most confident patrons tempered their words. He smiled quietly, understanding that its impact extended far beyond a single bar confrontation. She had changed the social fabric of the town with nothing more than her presence and composure. Rick Turner, feeling the weight of responsibility, sought to make amends not through words alone but through action. He volunteered at local events, helped neighbors with chores, and even attended seminars on conflict resolution. Every action he took was subtly influenced by his demonstration of strength, measured, deliberate calm. In his private moments, he would reflect on her precision, the way she had neutralized his aggression without aggression of her own, and how she had transformed not only him but the community around her. The local newspaper eventually ran a story, recounting the night's events in vivid detail. It described the tension in the bar, Rick's initial arrogance, and its measured, disciplined response. Yet the article focused less on the confrontation itself and more on the broader lesson, that courage and strength are not always loud, that authority does not always shout, and that respect is most enduring when it is earned through discipline, not intimidation. The piece went viral in neighboring towns, cementing its reputation as a figure of awe and inspiration. Children began to hear the story, wide-eyed and fascinated. They asked their parents about, imagining her as a superhero of discipline and calm. Some mimicked her posture, her careful movements, and her serene composure in their games. Teachers, too, found themselves using the tale as a lesson in control and respect. The quiet woman had become an unspoken mentor to an entire generation, demonstrating that power is measured not in noise or violence, but in awareness, self-control, and the quiet mastery of one's abilities. Aware of the impact she had inadvertently created, remained humble. She did not seek accolades, publicity, or attention. Her satisfaction came from knowing that the lessons she had embodied, the lessons of preparation, discipline, and awareness, were being absorbed naturally by those around her. She moved through the town with the same quiet confidence she always had, aware that true leadership is not proclaimed, but silently observed, felt, and remembered. Rick, observing from a distance, understood this truth more fully than anyone. His initial humiliation had transformed into gratitude and admiration. He approached her one afternoon, quietly and respectfully. "I want to thank you," he said, his voice steady but earnest. "You didn't just teach me a lesson, you taught the whole town something I could never have explained." Nodded, acknowledging his words with a simple tilt of her head. She did not lecture, she did not boast. She simply allowed the acknowledgement to exist, letting her calm presence speak louder than any words could. Over time, the bar became a symbolic place for reflection, conversation, and shared stories of courage and restraint. Patrons would recount demonstration as an example of mastery, not as entertainment. The tale transformed from anecdote to legend, and its influence spread subtly but profoundly. Even those who had never seen her in person felt the story's power and internalized the lessons it carried. The town began to change in subtle ways. Conflicts were approached with more patience, arguments de-escalated with calm reasoning, and respect became a more common currency than intimidation. The impact of one quiet woman's discipline had rippled outward, transforming behaviors, shifting perceptions, and subtly reshaping the community's values. Had taught without force, had led without words, and had left a legacy that would endure far longer than any physical display of strength could have. Years later, the story of the quiet woman who had subdued a man with nothing more than composure and precision was still told in the bar, at community events, and around dinner tables. Children who had grown up hearing it passed the story to their own families, embellishing small details but preserving the essence. Calm strength triumphs over arrogance, discipline commands respect, and true authority is often silent. The legend of the quiet woman had become inseparable from the identity of the town itself. Even as she faded into the routine of ordinary life, its presence remained a touchstone, a reminder that strength is not measured by noise, violence, or aggression, but by control, awareness, and the quiet mastery of oneself. Rick Turner, transformed by humility and respect, embodied her lessons in his actions, serving as an example that change is possible when one witnesses true mastery firsthand. By the time the sun set on the town, casting a warm glow over the streets and buildings, walked quietly among the people who now carried her story. No fanfare, no recognition, no applause, just the subtle acknowledgement that her impact was permanent. She had changed lives, taught lessons, and reshaped perceptions, all without ever seeking attention. And in that quiet, understated way, she became legendary. The town would never forget the night the quiet woman walked into the bar, subdued a man's aggression with calm authority, and left a permanent mark on every life she touched. Its legacy endured, not as a story of violence or confrontation, but as a testament to the power of discipline, the strength of composure, and the indelible impact of a quiet, unassuming hero. And so the legend of the quiet woman lived on, untouchable, serene, and forever respected. A reminder that true strength is silent, lasting, and impossible to ignore.